So, Metroid Dread is out, and I'm happy to say it's a great game. Yeah, I'm not going to leave you in suspense this time. It is a legitimately great game, and I highly recommend you get it. And this video is likely going to come out almost 2 weeks after the game's release. And, well, you guys saw how long that last video was. So this video is going to be less of a do I recommend it, do I not recommend it type of thing, since again, you know, you've probably already come to a conclusion on that. In fact, you've probably already beaten the game by the time this video comes out. So this review is just going to be a culmination of my thoughts. The thoughts of somebody who's been a fan of the franchise for a long time. I've played pretty much all the games in the series, except for the 2 remakes, weirdly enough. Of which the remake of Metroid 2 is the same developer that developed this game, and from what I've heard of Samus Returns, it sounds like Mercury Steam has improved quite a bit since then. But is it a true Game of the Year contender for 2021? Well, just stick around and find out. But before we get into this, do the things the algorithm likes, aka liking and commenting, or disliking, that works too. I'm more than familiar with the dislike button by now. And of course, subscribe if you'd like to see more reviews and blah blah blah. You know, you've heard the spiel a million times. So without further ado, let's wipe out the X-Parasite. Now you and I both know that Metroid Dread is a great game, but does it really stand with the best of the franchise? Well, to give you that answer, first I gotta tell you my favorites in this subgenre. And believe it or not, Super Metroid is not one of them. I think it's a great game, really pushed the genre forward at the time. It is much better than Metroid 1 and 2, and it has an amazing soundtrack, honestly. But pretty much every aspect of its gameplay has been surpassed since. No, my favorites in this genre are Metroid Prime, which I believe really innovated on the genre. There is no game out there like Prime 1 and 2, even to this day. It took the core formula of these games and translated it nearly perfectly to the FPS genre. And Prime also had an amazing soundtrack as well, and in my opinion is one of the few instances where a Western developer, in this case Retro Studios, actually surpassed the original Japanese developers. My favorite 2D Metroidvanias are Castlevania Symphony of the Night and Hollow Knight. They both have a lot in common with their design philosophy. Both of them have fairly open worlds that allow you to explore freely, a beautiful art style, though I certainly favor Symphony of the Nights. I think Hollow Knight's is a little bit too monochrome. They both have simple but satisfying combat. I'll give Hollow Knight the edge on that one. And Castlevania favors RPG mechanics, while Hollow Knight favors Soulsborne-esque mechanics. Both excellent games in their own right. So how does Metroid Dread compare to these apex titles in the genre? Well, mechanically, you're going to be extremely familiar with the style of gameplay if you played any previous Metroid game, especially Metroid Fusion. In many ways, this is a direct sequel to Metroid Fusion. Both story-wise, gameplay-wise, even world design feels heavily inspired by Fusion. And coincidentally enough, or maybe not so coincidental, Metroid Fusion was my first exposure to the franchise. And so, let's talk about the gameplay mechanics. So, like pretty much every other Metroid game, at the beginning of the game, Samus loses pretty much all of her abilities. At least in this game, they don't add insult to injury by giving you most of them at the beginning to play around with. But you can run fairly quickly, jump, slide, shoot your power beam, and of course you can also shoot missiles, one of 2 limited resources in the game. On top of these mechanics that have been in pretty much every game in the franchise, the 2 most important will be the manual aim, which essentially you hold L1 and you stand still and it allows you to aim in any direction, which you're going to be using a lot, especially in boss fights. And the counter, which was a sort of controversial change made in Samus Returns. You could argue the mechanic even started in Other M, which many people hated that game for good reason.
The baby. Adam. It was clear that the Galactic Federation.
Video games are a visual medium! And how the parry works is, whenever you see an enemy flash yellow right before one of their attacks, you hit parry, and you parry them, and it instantly charges up your charge beam. and usually kills the enemy. Pretty much any enemy in the game, except for bosses, dies to a single parry plus counter. Honestly, I'm not so sure why this was a controversial change. Again, I didn't play Samus Returns, so maybe it was worse in that game, but I think this is only a positive change. It's one of the many things in this game that makes it feel more skill-based than previous games in the series, and this is also certainly the hardest game in the franchise, and that's not a bad thing for the most part. I have a couple small problems with the way this game handles difficulty, but we'll get into that later. And over the course of the game, you get access to many abilities. As far as I'm aware, this is the most upgrades you get in the entire franchise. Not gonna look that up because I honestly don't care if it is or isn't, but it certainly feels like it. I'm obviously not gonna waste the time to name all of them. You're familiar with many of these, again, if you played any other games, like Morph Ball or Space Jump, Grapple Beam, Charge Beam, etc., etc. The main new ones are the Aeon abilities, which uses a separate meter. These honestly didn't come up that often. The one you'll be using the most is the Phantom Cloak, which essentially lets you turn invisible, and also silences your footsteps, and jumps, and climbing, which you'll be using to hide from the E.M.M.I.s, which are basically the main featured enemy of this game, the nearly indestructible research robots that were hacked and are now trying to kill you. There's also a shadow dash sort of thing, I forget what it's actually called, but it lets you dodge sideways, mainly just another way to dodge boss attacks and also extend your jump a bit. And finally, there's an ability that allows you to reveal all hidden blocks on the map, extremely useful when you're going for that 100%, obviously. Probably the best thing about the way this game controls is just how fast it is. It really does feel faster than any game in the series. Especially if you really master the parries. You can basically just rush through areas, counter anybody who tries to hit you, kill them, keep running, and it really takes no time at all to get around to where you need to go. The only complaint I have with the controls is that they're a little bit too slidey, a little bit too imprecise. I kind of wish there was a way to just walk, especially if you could walk while aiming instead of having to stay still. Because the aiming itself feels a little too imprecise. Even when I switched to a pro controller about half the way through the game, it really didn't help that much. The game asks a little bit too much from you for how imprecise the controls are. Now I'm sure speedrunners who've mastered the game can do like a no-hit run or some crazy thing like that. But for the average person, using the left analog stick to aim is not good enough for me. And it probably won't be good enough for you. You're probably going to get hit a lot of times, or maybe fail some jumps with the grapple beam that you think you shouldn't have failed, all because it just kind of feels off. The biggest change to the gameplay are the E.M.M.I.s. These nearly indestructible research bots can kill you instantly. If you touch them, you get one very tight window to parry them, and if you fail that, they kill you. So what you have to do is you actually have to sneak around in these areas. Samus makes a lot of noise, obviously. So pretty early on you get access to the Phantom Cloak, which allows you to hide from these guys. And that's about as expansive as it gets. There's 7 of these across the map, though 2 of them are essentially killed for free, so they don't really count. So in these 5 separate areas spread across the map, they're basically huge, mostly empty rooms that you're just running away from the E.M.M.I. And I honestly thought they were handled mostly well. While there isn't that much variety in the gameplay, except for the fact that the later you get in the game, the more movement abilities you have access to, so it's a little easier to get away from the E.M.M.I.s. I didn't get bored of this new gameplay style. I thought it was perfectly serviceable. The only thing I really didn't like was to kill them, you have to defeat this brain with an eye on it in the area. I don't know if that's a nod to Mother Brain or not, if there's any relation. Wouldn't be surprised. And once you kill those, you get temporary access to an Omega Beam, which you essentially have to wear down the E.M.M.I. by blasting it with this really rapid fire beam, which means you have to find an area of these maps that has flat ground to give you enough time to shoot it. The problem is, the imprecise aiming controls will get you killed, period. I can't really think of any other way to describe it. In any case, probably 4 or 5 of my deaths was simply because I couldn't aim for the thing's face fast enough to be able to blast off its shell and then run away and charge up a charged shot and shoot it in the face. That part was usually the easy part. But the rapid fire blasts, it was a pain in the ass. So I guess the question is, why is this fun? Basically, if you like exploring, finding hidden collectibles, upgrading yourself, having very simplistic combat that basically just means shooting stuff, then the core gameplay experience is pretty fun. But honestly, what elevates this above most of the previous games in the series are the boss fights. The boss fights are actually surprisingly good. This is where the comparisons to Hollow Knight are going to come into play, because Hollow Knight is probably the shining example of how to handle bosses correctly in a 2D Metroid style game. In Hollow Knight's case, the bosses felt really well designed, but maybe a bit too easy. I'm sure some people struggled with Hollow Knight, but honestly, I never even died until about 2/3 of the way through the game. No, I'm not humble bragging. I'm just saying, if you played a Souls game, you know that any game that allows you to heal, you just need to wait for the right opportunity. And Hollow Knight, as long as you observed your enemy's abilities carefully and had semi-decent reaction times, you could get your ass kicked and then heal back all the way to full health at the right opportunity. Metroid Dread doesn't give you any such leniencies. This is honestly one of my bigger problems with the game. Without a doubt, this game has trial and error difficulty, which I would say is never a good thing. I'm not going to say I was ever enraged by how unfair some of these bosses can be the first time you fight them, but it just means that against the big bosses that you'll fight throughout the story, you're probably going to die at least once because the game is designed that way. In Hollow Knight, for all of the core game bosses, I'm not talking about any of the end game super bosses, of course those get more difficult, but frankly I think that's just bad design. You should have a linear scale in difficulty, or preferably, especially since Hollow Knight clearly took a lot of inspiration from Dark Souls, the game should have been harder from the start, but all of the enemies gave you plenty of time to dodge their attacks. In Metroid Dread, you're only given half a second or less to memorize each of the animations, winding up for huge, nearly screen-covering attacks sometimes. And even if you're fairly diligent about collecting secrets, most of the bosses in the game can kill you in like 5 or 6 hits, with no reliable way to get your health back, unlike Hollow Knight. I think the biggest example of this is, spoilers, though I'm sure you've played the game already, Kraid is back. Or at least a Kraid is back. I'm sure there's others of his species, and this is just another one. Who knows? I don't know the lore. Kraid was a huge difficulty spike in this game. He's pretty much the first real boss that requires you to control the game well and really pay attention. He took me about 4 tries. For contrast, the first boss I died against in Hollow Knight was the final boss. No, I'm not joking. The only 2 other times I died before that is because I was out of soul energy and I died to an environmental hazard. Over the course of 6 hours in Metroid Dread, I died probably 15 times. Oh, and those 15 times are not counting the one-hit kills from the E.M.M.I.s. If you count that, I probably died 30 times over the course of the game. But where the boss fights shine is the spectacle. This is something that none of the other 2D Metroids, nor Symphony of the Night, nor even Hollow Knight could really compare. There's something just really cool about some of these bosses' attacks. How they can cover like the entire screen except for a tiny bit, or the entire arena shifts, or how some of the boss fights have multiple phases which completely changes the fight. And of course, finally, the counters. Because yeah, of course, each of these major bosses has an attack that you can parry. And if you parry it, you get this really cool cinematic kind of God of War style. And yeah, it's awesome. It's really fun. I liked it. So boss fights, probably the best in the series, just need a little tweaking in that difficulty department. So of course, it wouldn't be a Metroid game without exploration. How does Metroid Dread handle this? Well, to be honest, this is probably the aspect of the game I'm the most conflicted on, because like I said earlier, this feels like a direct sequel to Fusion. And if you played Fusion, you know that it's the most linear 2D Metroid in the series. That game funneled you down a very specific path, and at a certain point in the game, about 3/4 of the way through, it actually locked off all previous areas and you couldn't go back to them. Thankfully, Dread doesn't do that, but Dread is just about as linear as Fusion was. There's even many points in this game where it will block off all the other pathways except the correct one. Now, there's one point in the game I actually think this was necessary. It happens very early on, but essentially you have to go to Kataris, the lava region, and when you go there, all the available doors lead to superheated areas, and you don't have the Varia suit yet, so it kills you pretty fast. And so, you're thinking, well, what the hell am I supposed to do? You take the elevator back, there's no other way to go in the previous zone, so you take the elevator back up, start shooting walls, because it's a Metroid game, you know you gotta shoot walls, and lo and behold, left of the elevator in Kataris, you could just shoot the wall, and that's the way you're supposed to go. I've heard people complain about this, and maybe there's a small amount of merit to it, but if you know anything about a Metroid game, you know you're supposed to shoot walls. All the way back to the original game in the series, which is extremely hard to actually beat without a guide. 80% of that game was basically locked behind random walls that you could shoot through. Honestly, really terrible design. At least in this game, you can reveal hidden blocks using missiles or morph ball bombs. But other than that one specific instance, this game is very linear, but it feels intelligently designed. Because the thing is, I'd say roughly half the time, there's nothing stopping you from exploring the rest of the area you're currently in, and you can get a bunch of those hidden upgrades, but there's all these elevators and teleporters that take you between the various areas, and they actually lead from point A to point B where you're supposed to go next. And honestly, it impressed me. It really impressed me how they designed the map, because it never took me more than 5 minutes to figure out where to go next. Now, there is one huge downside to this, and I mean huge. And this is only if you plan on going for 100%. But this map is an absolute clusterfuck when you're trying to find all the items. Because over the course of the story, certain parts of the map get locked off. So that means if you're going to, let's say, Gavorin, and you want to get all the items there, you can only get about 80% of them from whatever elevator you took to get there, because the last quarter of the map is blocked off to a completely separate elevator with no other way to get to it. In fact, you can actually trap yourself in areas of these maps, because the first time you went through, they were sealed off by the types of blocks that only break when you stand on top of them, so there's no way backward. So I've heard many people talk about, oh, this game's only 6 hours long. Which, yeah, even me going through the game at a fairly leisurely pace, it took me about 6 hours and 15 minutes to get to the final boss. But I decided to go back and get all the items because, you know, I like 100%ing these games. But even using a guide to help me solve some of these Shine Spark puzzles, of which there are many, and they're very annoying. Some of them were fun once you finally got all the timings down perfect and you knew all the times to like store your Shine Spark, use it on a ramp to start using the booster again and then storing it again, or like bouncing off of different walls and stuff. All of that was cool until you realize you had to do 12 or 13 more of them, and they're all hard. Not to mention, it takes so long to get to the various areas of the map. It just feels like it was designed specifically for the main linear path in the story, and not really for exploration. Not to mention, this map is fucking huge. It's not as huge as Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight's map is probably at least 50% bigger than this one. And Hollow Knight had an insane amount of backtracking in it. That's something this game has over that game. The amount of backtracking in Hollow Knight actually pissed me off. There should have been like twice as many stag stations as there was. But then, when you get to 100%ing this game, it's as bad as Hollow Knight. That's the problem. So yeah, while on one hand, I'm really impressed with the very natural way that this game feels both linear and open world in a sense. In reality, it's at its best when it's purely linear, and going for 100% is not worth it. There's no secret ending or anything. All you get is some artwork. Same goes for beating the game under a certain amount of hours. You just get concept art from one of the title screens in the series. Not worth it at all. In conclusion, is Metroid Dread really that good? Yeah, it's pretty great, actually. I have some minor problems with it, as I mentioned, but ultimately, it's still a pretty fun game. Feels like a good half step forward for the franchise. Honestly, at this point, I don't know how they would really innovate further with the 2D formula. Maybe they don't need to because there's such a huge gap in between sequels. I mean, Fusion came out, what, like 17 or 18 years ago? I don't even remember. But at the end of the day, I still prefer the Prime games. I still prefer Symphony of the Night too. Something about Dracula's Castle was just so well designed in that game. It felt open yet somewhat linear at the same time. It let you figure out things on your own. And it has some of the most beautiful pixel art in any video game ever. At the end of the day though, Metroid Dread is definitely a really strong Game of the Year contender. It's the second game to come out this year that I would say is a must play, the first being Psychonauts 2. I'm sorry I never reviewed that game. But yeah, it was great, this is great. I don't really care that this game is only 6 or 7 hours long. So of course there's going to be a debate whether or not this is actually worth $60. In my opinion, I'd say it is, because quality over quantity any day. But I'll leave it to you, you know. Some people do put a lot of value in game hours. Well, you probably saw the Far Cry 6 review, so you know what I think about that. For me, I put value in fun, and this game is fun. So I hope that this game sells well so that we might get another 2D Metroid, you know, 5 years from now. Hopefully not another decade or more. I'm really hoping Prime 4 doesn't suck. I'm not going to get my hopes up. At least Retro Studios is developing it now, but any game that has to restart its development, you know, that's not a good sign, obviously. And while I've actually been pretty impressed with their 2 Donkey Kong Country Returns games, this Retro Studios is still not the Retro Studios that made Prime 1. I'm sure at least 80% of their staff is different. But I don't really want to end this video on a low note, so, you know, praying for the best, prepared for the worst, and at least Metroid Dread was good. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Do the things the algorithm likes if you haven't already. Thank you to all my patrons. Let me know if there's something you'd like to see me throw up on there from the video making process. I know I haven't done anything with it in a while, so I might be able to throw something up there every once in a while. In the meantime, I'm probably going to take at least a few days off from video making. I haven't forgotten about top 10 overrated games, but between all these other game releases, it's been hard to find time to edit it. Like I mentioned in a community post, I'm sort of in the process of moving to a temporary location, so it's going to affect how I make these videos. It's really slowed down my process lately. You can probably hear one of my dogs barking in the background right now. That's one of the reasons. But in any case, just know I'm still working on that video. It'll come out eventually. I wanted to do some kind of horror game review this month, but honestly, I don't know what to review. And there's probably no time at this point, unfortunately. But I guess that's about it, so I'll see you next time, guys.